So this week we are starting the last part of our pattern generator for project 3. Today I'm going to go over just how to create a nested loop, which is going to allow us to make a pattern that has both columns and rows. So we'll be able to create a much more interesting and complex pattern that way. And then after that, I'll go over how to create some variation and do some different things with your patterns. Let's take a look at what a nested loop is and why it can be useful in coding. So anytime you need both rows and columns, so like a grid in a design or some data or something like that, you might need to use a nested for loop. So let's see if we can find some examples. So I'm just kind of looking at some game art here. You can see some really simple examples where you would see something created by a nested loop. So something like this where you have rows and columns. So you can see this game has like even rows and columns. And so there's a bunch of columns going that way. There's a bunch of rows going that way. And somewhere in this code, there's a loop saying what to put in each of these little sections, what to draw where. So eventually what we're working towards is sort of some different generated grid patterns. So you can see a lot of these kinds of examples online. A lot of these were generated with similar code to what we'll be making. So here's example of a grid where each section is broken down into smaller sections, so you get this kind of interesting pattern. Here's a really simple grid where you just have different size shapes. This is a bit more complex. You can start to see how you might use this to make some interesting designs for like a wallpaper or a t-shirt or maybe some curtains or something like that. This is a really simple design. It ends up looking pretty cool, but we're basically just choosing some different shapes here. Here's another simple one, just choosing different shapes, but we get kind of an interesting pattern. This has a little bit of a different approach, but it kind of has an interesting design as well. Here's some generated landscapes. Based on just a few simple shapes, you can create a lot of different interesting patterns. So in the second video, I'll kind of go over how to do some stuff like this. For now, I'm just going to go over the basics of creating nested for loop. So it's a little bit more complicated than these for loops we did before. So I'll spend a little bit of time going over that. So for today, I'm going to actually just start with a demo. So I'm going to open up GitHub and make sure I have this up to date. So I'll go to MMP 210 and make sure I'm up to date here, and then I'm going to go to Sublime Text. And I'm going to start a new project, so I'll go back to GitHub and just go Show in Finder, and then go to MMP 210. So I'm going to make a new folder. I'm going to call this Nested Loop. And this is just an example, so you don't need to have this folder. You can start with this, but then turn it into your pattern 3, which is what I'll do in the next video. So I'm gonna just grab my index, the P5, and style, and paste those in here like usual. And then in my main page, as I always do, I'm gonna add a new link here. So I have my examples, and then I have my like sort of assignments, I guess. So I'll put this example up here with the other one. So I'll say this is nested loop, and this will be the nested loop example. And so we're just going to look at how to create a nested loop. And I'm just going to kind of use some examples to explain it for this one. So I'm going to start that page. So I'll go to nested loop, open index.html. I'll change this title to nested loop example, and change the h1 as well. And now I'm ready to get going. I'm going to open up sketch.js, or I'm going to open up a new file to create sketch.js. So I'll save this under nested loops, sketch.js, and I'm just going to say And so to start, I'm going to start with my comment that I usually do. Okay, so I'm just going to say this is the nested loop example, and I'm working on this on April 10th, 2020. And so we're just going to start from here. So to start, I'm just going to make a simple sketch. So I'm going to say function setup and create canvas. And I'm going to make a square sketch for this lesson. And I think you'll understand why in a second, but you don't have to necessarily make a square sketch. So I'm going to make it a little bigger than usual. I'm going to say 500 by 500. And then I'm just going to do function draw and draw a little background, 220. And I'm just going to start by drawing an ellipse at 0, 0. I'm going to make the ellipse half the size of the whole canvas. So I'll say it's 250. Actually, you know what? Let's make it the whole size. Let's say 500. And so we'll take a look at what that looks like. There's a couple things I want to go over before we get into our loop. So I'm going to go to Tools. I'm going to go to Sublime Server and start Sublime Server, and then go to the browser, and I'm going to click on here and go to localhost 8080. So here's my Sublime Server. I'm going to click on MMP 210 and go down to nested loop example. So this is what our basic sketch looks like, and I just want to kind of review a couple things here. I'm just going to open the console just in case there's any errors. So this ellipse that we see here is being drawn at 0, 0. And so when we first start our sketch, remember that 0, 0, that origin point, is in the top left right here. And so if we draw an ellipse at 0, 0, we'll see part of the ellipse, but most of the ellipse is actually off the screen. And so if we want to move that ellipse onto the screen, we can move down into the middle. So I might move the ellipse to 250 or half the width. So now we see the ellipse is centered in the sketch. And then if I move 250 on Y, now we're 250 on X and 250 on Y. So now we're in the direct center of the sketch there. Another way that I can do that is just by using, when I have 500 by 500, that's what my width and height variables will be. So if I replace 250 with width divided by 2, that's going to essentially be the same thing. So it's the width is the whole canvas, and if I divide that by 2, I'll be right in the middle. Same thing with the height. If I do height, but then divided by 2, then I'll be in the middle of the canvas height-wise. So I'll do height divided by 2, and then for the size, I could do width or height since they're the same. I'll do width here. So basically what we see is our ellipse is kind of centered in our drawing. And so with our typical canvas, we just have this 0, 0 point. We have the width, which goes across from here to here. And then we have the height, which goes from the top to the bottom. And what we're going to see with our nested for loop is what we're going to have is, instead of like one kind of area to draw in, we're actually going to have like a grid. So we're going to start to make a grid of even cells, and each one of those cells, it's going to have its own like little 0, 0 area, its own width and height. And that way we can create a grid and then start to make a pattern or a design based on the grid. Probably we can real quick just talk about what nested means. So if you've never heard that word before, it basically means that one thing is inside of another. So you can think of birds in a nest. There's, a nest just holds a bunch of birds inside of it. But we also use this more generally to describe one thing that's inside of another. So when we have a nested loop example, we're basically going to have one loop that's kind of going across the page like we did in our previous example. But within that loop, we're also going to have another loop going down the page. And so for each loop we do on the X, we're going to do a whole loop on the Y. Then we'll go to the next X, do another loop on the Y. Go to the next X, do another loop on the Y. And we'll keep going. And the result of that will be basically a grid that fills up the whole page. So let's start creating that. So last week we did our for loop with just the x value, so we can review that real quick. So remember, a loop is anytime I want to repeat something more than once, I can use a loop. And for my first loop, I'm going to be using x because I'm going to be going across the page from 0x all the way over to width. So that's my first for loop. I'm going to say for let x equals 0. Remember, let is a special variable declaration, so it's just like var, except it only exists inside of the for loop. So we're going to use let here. So we're going to say let x equals 0, and then as long as x is less than or equal to the width, let's increase by 100 to start. So x plus equals 100. So 0 here is the starting point, which is right here. Width is how far we're going to go before we stop, so that's over here. And 100 is how far we're going to go each time. So we're going to go 100, 100, 100, 100, however many times we can across here. So to start, I'm just going to draw an ellipse. I'm going to say an ellipse at x, and for y, for now, let's just say 100 as a placeholder. And then for the size, let's do 100 because that's how far we're going. And so there's our x for loop. So we can see basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ellipses starting at 0. So the first ellipse x value is 0, and the last ellipse x value is going to be width. And so each one of these goes up by 100, 0, 100, 200, 300, 400, and then 500. So that works out pretty evenly since we're going up by 100. 500 is less than or equal to 500. So that's why we get that last one there. And then this next one that would be right here never gets drawn because our loop ends. So that's our for loop on the x. Let's draw our for loop on the y by itself, and then we'll combine them. To do our for loop on the y, we can say for, and we're going to do almost exactly the same thing. We're going to start counting at y equals 0. So start counting up here. And we're going to count as long as y is less than or equal to height. So as long as y is less than here, we're going to keep going. And we're going to increase y each time by 100. So if y starts at 0, we're going to go up by 100, and another 100, and another 100, and another 100, until we get to here, and then we stop after here. So I'm going to draw another ellipse. For this one, I'm going to use 100 as a default value for x, and y as the variable for the y value, and 100 for y. Okay, so there's one point at which these two guys overlap, which is when x and y are both equal to 100. That's this ellipse here. But now we can see our y for loop happening in the y direction. So we start with y equals 0, and then y equals 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. And so if we change any of these values, then what we see is a different either number of rows, a different number of columns, or different sizes. There's a lot of different numbers that we're working with, but they're all kind of related. So those are our two for loops by themselves. And what a nested for loop is when we put one for loop into the other for loop. So it's a little bit tricky, but all I'm going to do, I'm going to take out this ellipse here, and inside of my x for loop, I'm going to take out this y one, and I just want to fix the indentations. And so now I have let x and I have let y, and so I can have my y here for the y value of the ellipse, and for the x value of the ellipse, I'm just going to take the x from up here. So I'll delete this one and put x here. And so what that does is it gives us an ellipse for every sort of point in our grid, starting with 0, 0, and then going down. So it's a bit complicated, so I created a little visualization to try to make it a little more clear. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go to the notes here. Okay, so here's our same code. And I'm just going to step through the loop one by one, just to make it a little more clear what's going on. So if I click loop here, we'll see the first circle that's drawn by this loop. And you can see the initial conditions in that circle. So x equals 0 and y equals 0. With our nested loop, we can move stuff around a little bit. So the ellipse up here is kind of stuck in the corner. And if we want to move it into the center, like we did with our larger sketch where we had the ellipse filling up the whole square, we can just add to x and y right here. So we know that each column is 100 pixels, each row is 100 pixels. And so if I want to move x into the middle, I can just say x plus 50. So it'll take the x value that we get from the loop, so 0, 100, 200, etc. But then we're just going to add 50 to it. So that'll move everything over a little bit. And then we'll do the same thing with y. So that'll move everything down. And so now we basically have a square with the circle moved into the middle, just like we saw with our first example. So from there, we can start to think about how to design different parts of our pattern. So that's with the ellipse, which is drawn from the center. If we wanted to draw a rectangle, we could just draw it from x, y, 100, 100. And then that would just fill up the grid normally because the rectangle draws from the top left. So for the rectangle, 0, 0 is fine, and then width is 100, height is 100. For the circle, if we want it to fit inside of our little grid cell, we need to move it to the middle of the grid. So that's why for the rectangle, I can do just plain x, y. And then for this ellipse, I need to say x and then add a bit to it, x plus 50 and y plus 50. So I made a little visualization to make it a little more clear so we can actually just step through the loop at each moment. So you can see the same code here. X equals 0, x is less than width, x plus 100. Y equals 0, y is less than or equal to height, y plus equals 100, and then we have the same ellipse, x plus 50, y plus 50, and 100. And so when I click this loop button, we're just going to go through the loop one step at a time. So I'm going to click loop, and we see the first circle that gets drawn. So this circle right here. So basically we can see that that circle has our initial conditions. X is 0, y is 0. So those are the initial conditions, x is 0, and y is 0 that we start with. And basically we're right here in our loop. So we started x equals 0. Okay, so then this stuff is all good. And then we go on to the y loop. So y equals 0. Yes, y is less than height. And we haven't done this yet. So then we draw our ellipse. So y is 0, x is 0, y is 0, and the width is 100. So let's take another step. Okay, so now notice x is still 0. Okay, y is now 100 because we did y plus equals 100. So we're still in this loop. We basically just drew this ellipse, and then we went back to the beginning and tested y against height again. So that's how we get x is 0, y is 100. Okay, so let's loop again. So again, we get x plus equals, so again, we get y plus equals 100. So we see x is still 0, so we're still at the first part of our for loop, but now we've gone to the second part, or we've incremented y twice. And we loop one more time, so y plus equals 100, that gets us down to here. And so we're almost done with this loop, so y is now 300. It's still less than or equal to the height. Now x is 0, y is 300, and so we're finally going to reach the end of this loop. So once we get below the height, when I click loop again, we're going to go back up to here. So now you can see x is now 100, y is 0. So once we finish this for loop, we go back to the original for loop. That's how a nested for loop works. So we're still, even though we did for loops in the y value, now we're going back to x. And so we say x plus equals 100, so x goes from 0 to 100, and y goes back to 0. So remember, in our loop, we start all the code from scratch again. So inside of our for loop, for the x, we're actually completely restarting the y loop in here. So now we have x is 100, y is 0, so we loop again. So now we're inside the y loop again, and x is 100, y plus 100 gives us 100. Loop again, x is 100, y is 200. Loop again, x is 100, y is 300. And if we keep going, x is 200. Now we've gone back up to here. So we go x, so we're on, so we've done our y loop again. We're going back to the beginning, so x is 0, 100, 200, y is back to 0. So we keep going, and eventually, so if we keep going, eventually we get all the way down to where we filled up everything. So we've gone through each x loop, and every time we've done one, so we've gone through each x loop, so x 0, 100, 200, 300, and at each stop we did an entire y loop. So at 0 we did y, 0, 100, 200, 300, x 0, 100, 200, 300, x is 200, y is 0, 100, 200, 300, x is 300, y is 0, 100, 200, 300. So by putting one loop inside of another loop, we get a lot more complexity happening in our design. So now that we have our grid, we can start to design with it. And you may want to change some of the basic parameters of the grid. So let's look at how those work. And an easy way to do this is to use some different variables. So I'm going to show another visualization, and then I'll show including some variables to make this a little bit easier to work with. So in this visualization, I've just made these numbers interactive. So we see a basic grid here. In this case, x is 500 and y is 400. And if I move x here, what happens is that the beginning of our design moves to the left. So we probably don't want to do this, but you might want to move it backwards. Notice that as I move that x value, what happens is the beginning of the loop either moves this way or moves this way, but the end of the loop stays here. So even if x goes negative, there's still more of the pattern over here, because that's always going to be determined by how the conditional statement. So let's set x back to 0. So now this 500, which usually we have a width there, but just for the interactive, if I make this lower, you'll see that the ending point of the horizontal part of our design moves from width here backwards. And so we don't see the same immediate movement as when we change x, but we just see that the ending point of our design gets changed. So that's the conditional statement where we're normally going to have x is less than width. And then finally we have the column width. So x plus equals 100. That's how far we move each time. So if you want to have a denser pattern, you can decrease that number. So we'll have more columns. If you want to have a less dense pattern, you can make the columns wider. So then we have the same thing on the y-axis. Y equals 0, that's where we're going to start. So I can move this up or down. Then y is less than or equal to 400. Let's move this back down. So that's going to determine how far down our pattern goes. And then the y plus equals is how big our rows are. So then finally, inside of our each one of our cells, we have x. So right now I have x plus 0, y plus 0. So that means the circle hasn't moved at all. If I increase x, see how the circle moves away from that green dot? That's the origin point for each cell. And so x, y is always going to be at the origin point, and we can move away from that origin point in each cell using x or y. So I can move x over, I can move y down, and if I move them both, I can center my ellipsis. And then the last number there is just the size. So you can see how the pattern changes. If I have a very small circle, then I get this sort of smaller polka dot pattern. If I have a larger circle, then I get a, less space in between those cells. So I can start to kind of arrange my pattern using some of these values to get different effects. And then what I'll show a little bit more of is how to add other elements into the pattern. So if we want to create a pattern that's more than just some circles, we can add some other shapes in here. So I'm going to recreate kind of my face example from my first pattern, but now we're going to have it in a big grid. So I have the ellipse in the center. I'm going to turn on no stroke so I can start to work on my face. And I'm not going to add too much variation right now. I'll do that in the next video. So first of all, I'm going to want to add some variables in here to make it easier to do the design. So for example, if I want to change the number of columns with this 100, if I change that to 50, now I get this sort of blurring in between the shapes. Let's make this background a bit darker so we can see that better. So now my shapes are overlapping. I don't really want that, so what I could do is just change the size of the shapes down here. But then that kind of changes the whole thing, and I have to keep going back and forth. So a good way to fix that is to come up with a variable. You can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it width, W for width. So I'm going to say variable W, and if I set this to 100, I can put it in for the columns and the size of the ellipse. And so now if I change that number, so if I change it to 10, they both update. If I change it to 200, they both update. So that will fit. So I have the width, and then I can also use H for the height. So I'll do, for now, I'll just say height is equal to width. So they'll be the same. So that way I can change one number to update both the columns and the rows. If I want to have a different number of columns and rows, I can change this number to something else. So I'm going to put height next to Y. And so I'll just put a comment here, the width of one cell. And this is the height of one cell. So when I'm thinking about a cell, I'm just like thinking about one of these areas. Okay, so now if I want to make my ellipse, if I want to make a much smaller pattern, I can do that. I can make it bigger. I can make it very big. However I choose to design it, I can just change the numbers in here to see that design. So let's move this back to 100 for now. Let's add some more shapes in here. So we're working on this sort of character design. So for the ellipse, I'm going to say this is the face. And I'll make some eyes. So for the left eye, I'll do another ellipse. For this one, I'm going to say X. And if I say plus 50, I'm going to be in the middle of the face again. So I'm going to have to change that. And if I say Y plus 50, same thing there. But I want something smaller than the width. So I'll say for the eye, I'll say like width over 4. And I'll say this is the left eye. And I'll have to change the fill so I can see it. So let's give this a fill of, we can just make it green for now. Oh, and I have to make sure if I'm going to make that fill green, then I have to also make this fill white, because otherwise I'm just stuck with green. Okay, so now we have it kind of in the middle, so we can move it over and move it up a bit. So we're doing x plus equals 50 here. That's centering it. So this is another point where we might want to use width. So I could use width over 2 and height over 2 to keep that centered. Or I could just use numbers, either way. So for this one, I might want to use width over 2, but then I could say like minus 10 to move it over to the left a bit, maybe minus 20. Or I could say something like width over 4, that'll move it over. And maybe for the Y, I'll go down, so I'll say Y minus width over 4. Okay, so maybe y plus width over 4. Okay, so we can move the I up a little bit. And then I'm going to repeat that with the left eye, except I'm just going to change the x from a plus to a minus. Okay, so there we get our right eye. So it's a bit more complicated if you want to use these. If you settle on a number that you like, you can just use numbers here. But I like to use the variables here, just so if I do change this design, it'll stay relative. So if I change this to a 50, I get 50 even faces, and 100, and 200. So I can still update, if I use those variables, I can still update my pattern. If I didn't use those variables, so let's say I had like 50 here and 50 here, and then I had like 10 and 10, 10 and 10. The problem I'm going to have here is now, well, okay, that's already off. So let's do x plus 20. And I guess this would actually be x plus like 60 or something. And then y, let's do 20 and 20. Okay, so that looks kind of cool. We could keep working with that. The problem is if I change the width of my cell, now the eyes don't really fit in the design. If I go like this, they kind of change. So that's why you want to use variables versus hard-coded numbers. If you're like, if you have 100 and you're happy with that and you don't think you're going to update the pattern at all, then that's fine. You can just leave it that way. One thing that we're going to add is giving the users the ability to update the pattern. So if you want them to be able to change the width and height, that's something that you would need to have as a variable. If you don't really care about that, then you can leave the numbers hard-coded. So let's go back to the variables. So we have width over 2, height over 2. I'm going to say height over 4 for y, height over 4. And then we'll just do width over 2 minus 20. And width over 2 plus 20. Okay, so let's add our rectangle last for the mouth. So I'll stick with the green fill and I'll do a rectangle. I'll say x and y, and for the width, I'll just use the full width. We'll see how that looks. And for the height, I'll use like height over 4. And I'll add a little rounded corners as usual. I'll just use pixels for that because it doesn't have to be perfect. And this is the mouth. And okay, that doesn't look great, so let's move down on the x. So we have our mouth up here. We want to move down on the x. Okay, so I'm going to say x plus width, and then maybe move down. So actually, let's say x plus width over 2 to start. Oh no, actually I don't need to move over on x. I need to move over on y. So say y plus height over 2. And actually width is too big, so let's do width over 2 for the size. And let's do height over like 10. Okay, that's better. And so then we can move x over a bit. So let's say plus width over 4. And let's move y even farther down. So we added half of width. Let's add another quarter of the width. And so there we go. We're starting to get a little bit of a design here. So that's starting to look pretty good. But I'm going to pause here and I'm going to actually demonstrate a simpler way to do things. So using the translate function, this is actually going to add a little bit more code, but it's going to make it a bit easier to design your pattern. So I'm going to pause here. So this part, you can watch the translate part, and if you think it's too complicated, you can just skip that part and continue working with this setup. But if you prefer the translate part, that might be useful for you. You can watch that and then implement that in your code as well. So I'll show examples in both cases. So to quickly visualize the difference, let's go down and look at translate. So in this case, we have the same exact grid. It behaves the same way. Like if I move x here, it moves the grid. But now, instead of using x and y inside of our ellipse, I'm just translating to xy each time, and I'm using push pop. So basically what I'm doing is each time through my grid, I'm translating to 0, 0, then 0, 100, 0, 200, 0, 300, and then 0, 500, or 400, whatever that is, and then moving back to 0 to 100, 0, 100, 100, etc. So I'm moving each time, I'm translating to each of these points in our grid, and then I'm just drawing, and since I'm translating, now I can actually use 0, 0 as the origin point. So you can see now our ellipse doesn't actually use x, y at all, because now we can just use numbers here. So this is going to simplify your setup a little bit. I'll do another example with this, and so I'll just make a copy of this example and use translate. So you can kind of use either version as your kind of template, and then move from there. So I'm just gonna save this and then go to the Finder, and I'm gonna make a copy of this. So I'm gonna duplicate this, so nested loop, and then I'm just gonna say translate at the end. And I'm going to add a link to that. So I'm going to go back to the index page for the class site. And I'm just going to make a new link here. List item. And anchor tag. So this is nested loop translate. So I think some of you guys may find this is an easier approach. Some of you guys may find it actually is more complicated. Either one is fine. So again, the main difference is that in the current example, we have to use x and y for our shapes in order to fit them in the right place. So in our new example, so I'm going to open up nested loop, and I'm just going to change the title here. Oops. And then I'm going to open up the sketch here. So I'm just going to delete everything here and go back to our ellipse. So our ellipse is at XY, and let's just do 100 for the size. So we're back to our regular nested loop with translate, and we have X and Y for the ellipse. And again, if I wanted to move this ellipse into the center, I'd have to say like x plus 50, so that'll shift everything over. Y plus 50, that shifts everything down 50 pixels. But if I want to, I can actually use translate to move instead of keeping track of x and y all the time. And so let's go back. So if I draw ellipse at 0, x0, y0, even though my loop is still going, it's still running through all these points, my ellipse is right here because it's 0, 0, and that 0, 0 doesn't change. That 0, 0 stays right there unless we use the translate function. So now all I have to do is say translate to xy, and we'll move to xy, and then that xy will become 0, 0. One thing I have to be careful to do here is push and pop, because we're doing a bunch of translations, so we need to make sure they don't get accumulated as we go through the loop. So that's one part that makes it a bit complicated. Okay, so now we're back to our original example. This time we're using push and pop. You may have an easier time designing with this because instead of thinking about x and y, I can just say 50, 50, and everything moves over. And I can add in, if I want to say that again, that this is the that's the face, and next I'm going to have the eye. So I'm going to fill green again, and so now with my eye, instead of having to add x and width and height and all that stuff, I can still use width and height. Like width will still work here if I want to use width. But now I don't have to worry so much about x and y here. So I can just say, if I want the I to be a little bit to the left of the ellipse, I can just use something like 40. And if I want it to be a little bit higher, I can use 40 there as well. And if I want to use a smaller number, I can just do that. So left eye. Okay, so I can make the eye a bit bigger. And I can move it over a bit more. And once I'm happy, I can just go in the opposite direction. So one eye is 30, so we can move the other eye over a bit farther to 60 or 70 or 80 or however far we want to move it over. And then that's the right eye. So that's kind of the advantage of using translate, is once I do this push, translate, and pop down here, I can use numbers here the way I would if I was just designing a regular sketch without thinking too much about X and Y. I have the option of using width, like I can use width for the size, and I can use width over 5 for the size there, but I don't have to. It kind of depends. If you don't want your user to update the number here, if you want to make other types of user interactions on the page, then you can kind of leave that width and height the way it is. So let's add in the mouth just to finish it off. So we're going to say rectangle, and we'll move over just a bit on the X, so maybe like 25, and move down relatively far on Y, maybe try 80. And then for the width, we'll do something a little bit less than the width, so maybe 75. And then for the height, we'll do something small, 10 or maybe 20. And then a little bit of rounding, that's the mouth. Okay, so we got a couple things off. It's too big. Okay, and it's too far down. Well, depending on what kind of expression you want to get, it's also maybe a little too wide. So depending on what you're going for, you might change some of those values. That is it for the nested loop. We have a couple different examples that you can use as a starting point. In the next video, I'll go over adding a bit of variation with randomness, and then adding some user interface elements so that our user can change the pattern a bit, and then also save the pattern if they want to. So I'm going to go ahead and add these examples to the GitHub so you can take a look at them. So I'm going to say add loop examples and commit to master, and then just push to origin. So I'll have some links in the YouTube videos so you can take a look at those.